Welcome, everyone, to another Saturday webinar. Today we have Patricia Walsh with her webinar on generations. And she is a certified deep memory process regression practitioner. She has been doing, actually it's been quite a while since you've been doing that work, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of you have had a chance to see her if you've attended any of the conferences, because she does show up at NORWAC and UAC and the ESAR conference and various NCGR. She also does multidimensional healing work based on shamanic principles. So she has a really interesting combination of working with intuition as an approach, as well as a therapeutic approach, and she does focus a lot of her work on the evolutionary style of astrology. So today she's going to be looking at generations from this perspective. So I am going to be turning the screen over to you, Patricia. Welcome. It's very nice to have you here with us today.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Enid and staff of Kepler. Okay, here we are. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to be talking about generations, as Enid said, generations as they're demarked by Pluto in signs. First thing I want to say is I really wanted to start this lecture with a YouTube clip by Billy Joel called "We Didn't Start the Fire." And I'm really going to encourage you to, after the lecture, go to YouTube, and I'll put the specific one at the end of this presentation, because he covers 40 years of history in 4 minutes. And I just really wanted to stir your kind of collective memory for those of you that have been alive for the periods that he covers. It's really interesting, and if you can find the ones that have the pictures that come up as with the lyrics, it's really great. This is hopefully given to you as a handout, and I hope that maybe some of you have been able to print it out and refer to it, because as I'm talking, I'm not going to be returning to this slide often, but this is, it's a great overview of Pluto's time spent in signs, and also shows, I did a lot of demographic study for this lecture. I gave this lecture several years ago at NORWAC and have done it in a few different places and retune it each time, and I retuned it again for today. So the demographic information is really quite interesting. What you'll see, what I'm showing you here, is that when Pluto tenants a sign, and you can see that from Pluto Cancer to Pluto Capricorn, or even to Pluto Sagittarius, it spends 25 years in Cancer versus 30 years in Pluto and Sag. So, that indicates a kind of shortened period for the specific psychology of a generation, but the demographic studies cross that. So, as I said, I did a lot of research on the demographics, and that's what you see here. If you're looking at Pluto Cancer, the greatest generation to the silent generation are two generations that were defined by demographic studies. Yet, even when you read the demographic studies, you'll see a commonality in the basic psychology. I also want to apologize up front that I'm focusing largely today on American culture only. Not that America is the center of the universe, although many people believe it is. I don't. It's just that there's too much information, and so I really needed to, look at these trends in the U.S., and so I'm focusing largely on that psychology. Let me talk about the generational psychology. So as Enid was saying, astrologically, like I said, I'm crossing astrological and demographic information. So astrologically, we look at Pluto in a sign as defining a generation specifically because they're coming in with a singular or a shared bottom line intention. There's a basic psychology. This is part of what the archetype of Pluto is about. It's the way that the force of evolution has worked on the soul and continues to work on the soul. So the point that I want to make is when Pluto is in a sign, that's demarking a shared generational psychology that also includes karmic content. There are a lot of schools of esotericism that say souls incarnate in groups. And I know I see it from my work that, and this is the real meaning of why history repeats itself, because each generation's coming in with a shared common karmic experience, either from very specific time frames in the past or specific themes that they share. So there's key issues for each soul group, and that's another way of thinking of Pluto in a sign. That's a soul group. So you belong to a particular soul group that shares a bottom line psychology. In evolutionary astrology, when you take Pluto in sign, you also have to put it in the house. So in an individual chart, I want you to just be aware that that also is going to condition the consciousness and the description of the kinds of karma that somebody's bringing in, or the kinds of soul issues that they're bringing in. So an easy way to say it is, when it's in a sign, it's generational and it's a bottom line psychology, and when you put Pluto in a house, that's when it gets personal. As I talk about each generation today, and I really have a lot of information, so I'm going to have to talk really fast. When I talk about each generation today, I'm going to talk about them in different stages. And I'll interweave that in the way that I'm talking about them. But there's 3 specific stages of each generation and how they affect the collective. They have when they're born. And again, metaphysically or spiritually, we can understand this, that they bring in with them an energy. They're already preconditioned. It's not a blank slate. They come in already with a whole karmic history behind them, and since when they start to get born on the planet, they actually bring that consciousness here, and it affects the living generations. An example of this that I see today is when the Pluto Scorpio started to be born, and I'm going to talk about this more when I talk about Pluto Scorpios. They brought Armageddon. We can thank them for this. They brought Armageddon consciousness onto the planet. And this is based partially on their past experiences. But, ever since they started getting born, it was the end of the world as we know it. So we have to think of a generation when it's born, and then we think of a generation when it's coming of age, which is basically when they're starting to form a social awareness, the understanding that there's a society beyond just them and their peers. And that's generally the mid-teens to 20s, high school into college years. And the events that happen during that time really shape their psychology, their present life psychology. And then another stage of each generation is when they come into power. And in the Western world, that typically is when they're entering the workforce. And not only when they're entering the workforce, but when they're growing into positions of power within the workforce, where they start to influence culture and society. And that isn't, of course, just through work. It's also through the creative arts, or the writers, authors, musicians, etc. So an example we've had recently of this, where we saw a changing of the guard, is Obama. And Obama was the first major political leader of the Pluto Virgo generation. So we kind of saw that change of the Pluto Leos waning and the Pluto Virgos waxing. This slide is showing Pluto's elliptical orbit. Pluto doesn't have a nice little round orbit like everybody else. Pluto kind of goes way into the far reaches of space, into the icy depths, and then comes back into orbit. One point I want to make out here, where I have my cursor here and here, is a very interesting time within Pluto's orbit. This is actually a span of 20 years when Pluto crosses within the orb of Neptune. No, they're not going to crash together. Ne'er the twain shall meet, but it crosses into Neptune's orbit. And that happens, as I said, every 20 years out of this whole orbit itself takes 248 years. I want to show you what this looks like in the signs. So this next slide shows you a rough approximation of when Pluto comes here into the orb of Neptune, is actually where it starts here and comes out. This is also called perihelion. This is where Pluto comes closest to the sun. Here's another approximation of it. And you can see the signs that Pluto was in when this happened. We just recently had this 20-year time frame happen out of Pluto's 248-year orbit. Pluto, when it was in Libra, passed within. When it was in Scorpio, it was at the apex of its perihelion, and then in Sagittarius. So what does that mean? We have to combine and start to think about, what does Pluto and Pluto and Neptune mean? So if we think of the archetypes of Scorpio and Neptune, Scorpio itself, Pluto itself is, again, in evolutionary astrology, we're looking at the force of evolution of the soul. Neptune, in a sense, generally a lot of people like to describe that as that it's a spiritualizing force. I have another lecture on my website. If you're interested, you can go to my website. It's called Pluto Passages, where I talk about the interplay between personal will, spiritual will, and higher will, or in other words, ego, soul, and spirit. So basically we could say that this force of the soul somehow meets something within spirit, so there's an increased spiritualization happening. I want to point out that right here at this point in 1987, and not that this is such a huge landmark event, but it's an interesting event because it was a culmination of previous generations and kind of a flavor of the era of our time. This was the harmonic convergence. And this is actually where the New Age got to be known, thanks to the likes of Shirley MacLaine and everybody else that was, proponents of the New Age. A lot of the New Age tenets that, I was in the grocery store the other day, and there's a whole aisle of drinks called New Age drinks. I mean, that's how common it's become. And when you go back to something like the 1920s or the 30s or even before that, and you think of the term what might have been alternative spirituality, it was not very prevalent, and it's very, very prevalent now. So I just want to point that out here, that that's a possible manifestation of that. Okay, let's get into some generations. I'm going to start with Pluto Cancer here. So if you have your handouts, you can continue to look back at the years and the different generations that are defined there demographically. Pluto in Cancer had come of age in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. So this is, of course, because Pluto was in Cancer for 25 years, it's a longer generation. Again, a larger shared psychology amongst many people on the planet at the time. They started to come into power in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, again, a longer span of time, and really influenced, industry and culture. There's a general theme for this generation, and it's called Give Up Everything for Family and Country. That's how they're characterized. They're characterized as a sacrificial generation, and that family, country meant everything to them. Let me talk about the Cancer archetype a little bit in general. As we know, Cancer is a cardinal archetype, and on the zodiac wheel, it's at the bottom of the zodiac wheel, so it has something to say about our roots, where we come from. It relates to our ancestry, our psychic inheritance. A simple way also just to toggle your own memory, or to jog your own memory and associations when you think of generations, is to also think of Pluto with the ruling planet. So think of Pluto with the moon. And if you were looking at an individual chart or your own chart, what is that, what does that usually indicate about somebody, Pluto-Moon contacts? When we think about things like this in personal charts, we're thinking of women and women's issues. We're thinking of mothering, and maybe there's some intense childhood experiences that deeply condition the person that need to be worked on. I always refer Cancer to, or I call part of the heart of this archetype the lunar inner child, as opposed to, in the next sign, Leo, the solar inner child. The lunar inner child needs are likened to the time frame where we're an infant to preschool. We have very deep, vulnerable security needs during that time. This is the foundation of our ego formation, happens during this time. Many of our deep security needs at the time are pre-verbal, and the insecurities that arise when they haven't been met kind of manifest as emotional manipulations, or more prevalently suppression of our own needs. So within this archetype we can see that there's a nurturing or a lack of nurturing sometimes as part of the wound in the psyche. This is also a stage where we have deep unconscious imprinting. We kind of take in mother's emotional state wholesale. Think again, infant, you know, taking in mother's milk. This is part of the formation of our identity happens through the mirroring that happens with mother, but we are completely enmeshed within her psychic field at that time. So this relates to, within this archetype, also the propensity that we have to what's called deep subconscious imprinting. So there's deep imprints that we come in with, many of them below the threshold of our consciousness. And when we think of a generation that's come in under this archetype, we can think that, you know, they collectively came in with many of these issues unresolved from other lives, and many of them removed from their awareness because they're very deep in the subconscious. This particular generation I may spend a little more time talking about, specifically because they're a root generation. Again, we're talking Cancer. And because the arc of Pluto sped up so fast that we're now in the Pluto Capricorn era. We have so many generations alive, but so many of them are actually rooted in some of the things that happened with this particular generation, and still working that out. Another thing I want to talk about is this Cancer-Capricorn axis, which to me relates a lot to, if we think of Cancer and Capricorn, just solely archetypally. Cancer is home and mother, and Capricorn is the outer world at large. It's career, it's how we come out in the world, it's father. It also relates to inner world, outer world. Now, archetypally, the Cancer-Capricorn axis, to me, also speaks a lot to what they would say in Jungian psychology, and how it manifests in the psyche as the midlife crisis. Because what often happens on this axis is, again, archetypally, it's not the way it always plays out in society, but it did for this generation. Women stayed at home, raised the children, and then men go off and they do their thing, and then they get to a certain stage in their life, like the kids are grown up and they move on, and the woman is like, what am I going to do with my life? That's the energy of the midlife crisis. And the opposite happens for men. They've kind of accomplished what they need to do in the outer world, and then they come back, you know, maybe as they're getting to the retirement years, or even before that, where they have an emotional unfulfillment. Like, isn't there more than this? There must be. And they start to reach to the polarity. That's like Capricorn reaching to the polarity of Cancer, you know, wanting some emotional fulfillment, something else to nurture them. So we have a whole generation that lived this out quite dramatically in their time. and another point I need to make before I get on to that further is the Aries, Libra, Cancer, Capricorn axis also relates a lot to gender roles, and what I would call, excuse me, I would relate the animus to the Cancer, Capricorn axis. So if we think of Aries, Libra, Aries Libra itself is just the glyph of those signs. Aries is Mars, and Libra is, the rulers of those signs, is Venus. Those symbols alone are the symbols, the universal symbols for the male and female. So on that axis, we have something about gender identification. And then when we move to the other part of the cardinal axis, Cancer Capricorn, we have Moon and Saturn. And again, like I said, to me, this is inner world, home, as opposed to outer world, society. But the other interesting point is that it's only in Capricorn, which is a feminine sign, it's a yin sign, that has a male ruler. So that says something about the interplay between gender, but gender as it's identified internally, which is classically called anima animus. And again, as we talk about this generation, you're going to see how that played out for them. Another point I need to make, let me just go back one slide to help you here. I've also noticed this with generations. The sextile, so let's say we're looking at Aries to, or let's jump over here. Let's jump from Cancer to Virgo. The sextile, as we know in astrology, is a flowing aspect. In between generations, you often see this. There's a certain psychological resonance, I would call it simpatico, between these generations. Sometimes these are grandparent generations, but not always. When we get into the Pluto stay in signs that are shorter, it's not always that way. But archetypally, the sextile between these generations, and you'll see that as I talk, because I'm going to refer to it, is how there's a psychological resonance between them. I find it interesting that archetypally this is also understood in tribal cultures as quite frequently, especially African cultures, the grandparents to children's relationship is much more important than the child's to the parent. And they say that that's because both of those generations, the grandparents and the grandchildren, are closest to the ancestors on the other side. So the grandparents are preparing to leave and they're open to that world, and the grandchildren are just coming in fresh from that world. So that's interesting. And I think we see this in our culture anyway, where we see that there's some kind of simpatico between grandparents that parents don't have with their own children. Issues that arise in parenthood and child don't necessarily always arise in grandparent relationships. The other point that I want to make out, and I will be referring to, is the natural square. So when we see a square here, we're talking about, again, I'm looking at Cancer to Libra here. Now we know this is an opening square, this is a waxing square, and so there's some, in this square, let's say it implies that there's a tension. As we know with squares, there's always a crisis. What I've noticed in generations, though, is that there's some kind of fruition that happens. Sometimes in the opposition and lots of times in the square generations. So again, keep your eye out for that as I'm talking. I think that this opening square comes with a lot of new moon energy. So there's an impetus of youth for the generation that is square to the seed generation. Again, in this instance, I'm using Cancer and Libra. That this generation has some kind of youthful impetus, some new moon impetus to carry forward something that generation already started, and that they're able to get into the manifestation of that. So here's our Pluto in Cancers. As I said, the major issues, some of the major issues that this generation was conditioned by, they're born in the shadows of World War I. Most of them very young, but born into households that were in the shadows of World War I, came of age, and most of them fought in World War II. I'm going to talk about, get back to that later. Another issue I want to talk about that arose in the 1920s during the Pluto's tenet in Cancer is prohibition. This is a much earlier movement, but it bears, well, prohibition was enacted in the 1920s and then repealed in the 30s, so it happened during this generation's time, but it harkens back to much earlier women's movements that stretched all the way back to the early abolitionist and temperance movements. And guess when that was? That's when Pluto was in Aries. That's exactly what I'm talking about. That was the 1830s and 40s. So that's when women kind of started to get together and try to have a voice about issues within their day. And this natural square brought it back to this generation, that there was something that they needed to do with it further. Now, there were previous generations, as we know, I would say they inherited the fruits of their previous generations, stubborn Taurus Pluto people, and the Pluto and Taurus and the vocal Pluto and Gemini people. Their work allowed them to form the National Woman's Party in 1917. Happened in the early stages of Pluto and Cancer, and that particular party was instrumental in women getting the vote nationally in 1920. So they did get a political voice enabled by their predecessors. The point about why prohibition and abolition movements feed into this is because the drumbeat behind that, or let's even say the evolutionary tension behind that, wasn't so much about people shouldn't be drinking, although on the outer appearance it looked that way. The undercurrent was actually, you know, alcoholism was so rampant at that time. Men, I think the figures were something like 3 times the amount of the average 3 times the amount of alcohol consumed today. And what that led to was a lot of domestic violence against women and children. And they had no voice. They had no political platform. They had no advocates. Basically, they had no face in the outer world. This, again, thinking of the Cancer Capricorn thing. So these early movements that were formed largely by church groups and then women getting active in those groups are part of what happened with women, you know, the suffragette movement that came before, etc., women getting their voice. So it's an important thing to think about, again, when we're thinking of the Cancer archetype and the need for women's issues and issues that involve women to be dealt with openly in society. Another issue they were conditioned by, of course, the Great Crash and the subsequent Depression. This is the 1920s, 1939, and interestingly enough, you know, Pluto's in Capricorn right now, oppose that Pluto, not literally, but archetypally by sign, opposed Pluto in Cancer, and we're revisiting these issues again with another economic downturn. During this time was also when FDR enacted the New Deal and the Social Security Act. It's interesting when I was talking about the lunar inner child, and think about this generation alive at this time with the world wars and, you know, economic collapse and bread lines and all of that, how deeply they were shaken their emotional security needs. And FDR is the one that coined that iconic phrase during that time: the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. It's interesting, you would think that he was addressing, like, trying to address some of the emotional, not only economic, but emotional insecurity of the time. The other thing that's interesting to see is how that's morphed, because back then, Social Security and the New Deal was looked back then as a collective kind of nurturing, and today it's called entitlement. It's interesting how far we've come with that, or how distorted that's become over time. Another issue important to this generation was desegregation. This, you know, was Rosa Parks, the civil rights movements. This was the first generation, not that it didn't exist before, but this was the first generation to be forced to deal openly with it in society. It came to a head as they were coming of age, and as we know in the 60s, as they were coming into power, is when real movement and enactment happened on desegregation. It's an interesting thing I noted in my book on karmic complexes, that the Pluto Cancer and Pluto Leo generations, and as I've also worked with them personally in regression, people that have Pluto in the 4th house or Pluto in the 5th house, there's an archetypal resonance to Africa, specifically because Africa is the birthplace of humanity, or proposed to be. And so that would relate it to the Cancer archetype. And there's also the Leo side of it, which is just the natural pride and dignity of African peoples. So I find it interesting that African American issues started back in the Civil War, and because of slavery, again, come to a head and come to, you know, a need to be resolved and looked at through these two generations, Pluto in Cancer and Pluto in Leo. Demographically, this generation is kind of put together, like I said, the greatest generation, silent generation, under one title, and they call them the traditionalists. And this particular generation is described as being disciplined. They understand that history is a way to plan for the future. History to them is very important. Again, think Cancer archetype, our ancestry, our roots. They dislike conflict. I guess, 2 world wars will do that to you. They say that they are, again, past-oriented. They're uniform. In other words, they value uniformity as opposed to variety of the future generations. They like hierarchical organizational structure. I suppose this is the way that they feel secure. They're also described as traditional and conservative, again, speaking of our ancestry and our traditions. The greatest generation is often described as loyal, patriotic, honorable, frugal, and the silent generation, which is a subset of this, is interesting because, again, they share a quality, but they've been described as being withdrawn, cautious, and modest. There's another term for that generation, and they're called the suffocated children of the Great Depression. Think Pluto Cancer, again, think Pluto Moon, kind of interesting. They had to make do with what was there. And as I said earlier in the Cancer archetype, they're coming in already with a karmic issue of a deprived inner child. So this played out for them collectively. Child abuse, like I said, women's domestic violence against women was the first thing to come out, and then it really wasn't until the 1960s that child abuse came out. But we know it was rampant during that time, but it just simply wasn't reported. And it was actually in the 1960s, this pediatric radiologist, Dr. Henry Kemp, identified the battered child syndrome. And as you could imagine, that was through radiographic studies of children coming in with bruises and broken bones and things like that, that he started to put all of that together like, gee, something must be going on. And that resulted in 1968 in the beginning of the mandatory report law, which is still enacted. So it's, again, another example of things that are hidden in the home. Again, think Pluto Cancer, need to come out. They need to emerge. They need to come out in the Capricorn way to society so that they're reformed and changed. I think I mentioned that before. Maybe I didn't when I was talking about Pluto, that the polarity point to Pluto is the evolutionary direction. So we have the natal sign. This is true in everybody's individual chart. You have Pluto in a house and a sign, and that's going to represent, like I said, all of those things, your collective karmic issues you're coming in with, some of your soul wounds. The polarity point is going to point to where you need to grow to. So that applies to generations also. In World War II, because so many men went to war en masse at once the U.S. Got involved in the war, women went to work. And one of the iconic figures of that time was right here, Rosie the Riveter in the 1940s. She was a conglomeration of many women that went, although I believe it said that her image was one specific factory worker in Michigan. Women were forced out of the home. Again, this is evolutionary intention. They're saying, you've been staying home too much. They were forced out and into traditionally male models, male roles. They worked in factories. Now, the interesting thing, too, is that when the men came back from war, the women were forced back home. And there's several books written about that time, because those women then grew into be the housewives of suburbia in the 40s and 50s. And I think there was a book also called Suffocated in Suburbia, speaking of the suffocated inner child. So some of the women did experience that. They experienced this kind of coming out and then forced back into. So both world wars stretched these gender roles, but at the same time they kind of a little stubbornly upheld the traditional gender assignment. But in evolutionary astrology, one thing that we say is that when somebody, if I'm looking at an individual chart and somebody's got something karmically, be it Pluto or the moon's nodes on the karmic axis, in the Cancer Capricorn axis or the 4th 10th house axis, or you've got moon and or Saturn involved, that there's a propensity, it's not in every case, but there's a potentiality that that person is in some kind of gender switching now in the current life relative to past life experience. So that can play two ways. It could mean that now we've all been different sexes in other lifetimes, but sometimes some souls go on a little run where they have maybe 10 lives as a male. And then the soul goes, yeah, you know, next life, let's try being a female. So there's two ways that they do that. One is they have lives that are bridge lives where they start to, whatever issues come up, maybe they're a man born into a woman, a family of 7 sisters. And that might say, oh, okay, here's somebody who's preparing to switch gender in the next lifetime, but they're exposing themselves to what does it mean to be a woman. The other side of it can be where they're born into the opposite body of which they internally feel may be very masculine, and that's where we start to hear you know, of gender disidentification, such as people, you know, that describe themselves as transgender, or they just feel like they're the opposite gender within the body that they're in. Interestingly enough, so we had some of that gender bending going on during that generation as far as the roles, the sexual and gender roles that people were playing. But interestingly enough, in this generation, they were one of the first generations to introduce bisexuality more openly. Again, not that it didn't happen before, but Christine Jorgensen was born in the 1920s, she had Pluto Cancer, was the first widely known gender reassignment surgery. It did happen before, but she was the media sensation. On the cover of all the magazines, Dick Cavett Show, you name it, da-da-da-da-da. And we'll see this later. All of these actions of the people during this generation come to some kind of fruition in the Libra generation. There is a sextile to Virgo from this Cancer generation, as I was saying, and sometimes what I see is that the emergence issue that's here in the Cancer generation, the kind of coming out, there's a hesitancy, that's shared with Virgo. Virgo also has a whole coming out social anxiety thing that we'll get into when we talk about that. So now as this generation was coming into age and coming into power into 50s, in the 50s, this was the birth of suburbia. In the 1950s and 60s is when home ownership passed the 50% mark. I think that was for the first time in American history. And that was, of course, the Cold War era. So it was an era that was, you know, described as conservative, anti-communism. And again, if we think of the Cancer archetype, we're thinking of, you know, self-security, one's own home, one's homeland, you know, protectionism, and also the propagation of the American dream. The American dream was a big thing back then. Everybody, you know, going to suburbia and having their nice little home. One thing I want to mention here is pop culture. This is the first time this generation experienced it, and it also affected subsequent generations. This is when TV came into the homes en masse. And interesting, I found, and then I did this for all the generations, I looked at the popular TV shows that started to, you know, that they were watching when they were young and when they were at home, and when they're older. And it's so interesting because it really shows the psychology of that generation. So this particular generation, some of their popular TV shows, Father Knows Best, I Love Lucy, My Little Margie, and then there was another show called How to Marry a Millionaire, this is interesting because this is you know, it's like a scheming woman. I mean, I love Lucy. She was even a scheming woman. She was a very classic icon for that era, you know, full of fire and her own ambitions, but she had no real power in the outer world. She lived in the shadow of her husband's power. That is the Hera archetype. This generation, the women of this generation, I call them, they're a generation of Heras. Many of them ruled the home, but they didn't have a lot of power outside of the home. So the only other way to get power was to either manipulate your man, and that's what that show How to Marry a Millionaire was all about. It was teaching women how to, you know, how to be scheming and, you know, manipulate your man. There was also a whole slew, well, the Disney show was born then. There was also a whole slew of westerns, kind of interesting, Gunsmokes and Roy Rogers and Bonanza and Cheyenne and Wyatt Earp and all of that. There also was a couple really interesting honeymooners. Oof. I mean, that was a kind of throwback to what, or not a throwback, but just a little bit of an inkling of, you know, what went on in the home, because there was plenty of times where he would like make a fist and go, you know, to the moon, like he was going to punch her, and somehow that was socially, imagine if that was on TV today as socially acceptable. There was some male humor, Abbott and Costello, Three Stooges, and then this is where we also saw the birth of the soap opera. There was The Guiding Light, and As the World Turns, that's I have to entertain, if you're going to keep the women home, you have to keep them entertained. And it was also the birth of the kind of evening talk show or variety show, I'm not sure what genre that is, but like the Ed Sullivan Show and the Tonight Show. There were a few rule breaker shows which were interesting. Annie Oakley had a show, or there was a show about Annie Oakley, and The Bachelor Father. So a couple little rule breakers there. Let me just talk quickly about some of the people, some Pluto Cancers themselves, just so you can, again, start to draw correlations. Martin Luther King Jr., born in 1929. Again, the resonance with the issues of African Americans and Africa itself. Malcolm X. Castaneda, born in 25. And here's an interesting one, John Bradshaw, who was a pioneer of inner child work. This is, again, like I said, that's the animus, Cancer Capricorn axis, that wounded inner child. And his work was all about forcing out the secrets in the home. You know, he talked about toxic family systems and shame. A few others that worked deeply with family systems, Bert Hellinger, who was the founder of Hellinger Constellation Therapy. This is also showing the constellations of ancestry and how they play in past generations and current generations, and reworking the family systems so as to free all of the generations from the inherent issues that are being, in other words, the psychic ancestry. Stanislav Grof was another one, born in 1931. His whole work revolved around womb regression, the conditioning that you receive in the womb, everything I was talking about before. This was also the birth of depth psychology. Both Freud and Jung, coming of age during that time, they were Pluto Taurus generation, and so here they were starting to address, I guess, something of these Cancerian needs because they're so deeply wound in their emotional issues that they need to be addressed. So depth psychology comes in, and just again, Taurus is naturally sextile to Cancer, so there's a psychological resonance there. We have Gloria Steinem, Maya Angelou, just a few very influential women from that era. Nelson Mandela, who's an icon for the homeland and ancestry. And here's an interesting one, Charles Manson, who called his group what? The Family. Very Cancerian. Okay, so counseling this generation. I have worked with some of them. I've worked with several of them, and I actually worked with World War II vets, which they actually typify a lot, they typify the male persona of that time. They don't talk about things, you know. This is the emotional repression aspect of Pluto and Cancer, and actually that was kind of glorified in their era through World War II. That's what it meant to be. You go off, you fight war, you come home, you don't talk about it. So, you know, I found working with that generation that getting them to open up to their emotional dynamics and helping them to work through these issues of repression and suppression to get to the core of their emotional experience is a way to help them move into a deeper, authentic emotional security rather than just keeping the whole ball of you know, everything all under wraps. I'm speaking of parenting the inner child, which is part of what the polarity of Capricorn is about. I recently had a client, 75-year-old woman, who said to me before we started the session, she said, well, you know, I'm really embarrassed to say this, but I still can't get over the fact that my mother didn't love me. And, well, there you go. This is the part of the core of the generation that they do need to heal the inner child. And no matter how old you are, it's never too old to go back. Some of the women of this generation had been still conflicted about their place in the home versus the outer world. As I mentioned before, a whole generation of Heras. And here's a really cute, iconic person for this generation. This is Hazel Suarez. She's 94. She was born in 1915, very early in the Pluto Cancer generation. And in 2010, she graduated from college. Isn't that sweet? You know, Cancer is often associated with being a late bloomer. And again, relating back to that staying within one's gender-assigned role, but then, you know, coming out in the world later, as well as part of, like what I said, this generation is characterized by, that they put family, they put tradition, they put country first, and then themselves later. You know, this is it. They come later in life. And I had this client, gosh, this woman, she was 75, 76, and she was very shy to ask me during the session, but she said, you know, I've studied my whole life, I've studied astrology, and I've studied tarot, and she's living in a retirement community now with her husband, and she's like, you know, some of my people ask me about that, and she kind of sheepishly looked at me like, and said, you know, do you think I could do some tarot readings for them? And I went downstairs and I got a poetry book, and I came back upstairs in my session room and I said to her, I want to read you a poem. And it was actually, this poem was written by a Pluto Cancer, and it's called When I Am Old, I Shall Wear Purple. And I won't read you the poem, but you can look it up. And basically, that's what it says. So I leaned over to her and I said, wear purple. It's like, at your age, what have you got to lose? Why not? Throw caution to the wind. So this is, you know, part of the things that this generation brings in with them, and as they're aging, these are some of their concerns. Another thing I want to point out as far as the late blooming thing, the earliest Pluto Cancer, which is, say, 1914, 1915, they don't get their Pluto square until they're 57. They didn't get their Pluto square till they were 57. The late Pluto Cancers get it at 45. Now, we know that when we get a Pluto square, there is an increased evolutionary pressure going on. And compare that to some of the generations alive now, the Pluto Libras, they get it at 36. The Pluto Virgos also getting a Pluto square. Okay, so as I was saying about the Pluto Cancer generation, you know, archetypally and collectively, they put themselves on hold. They put everything before them. Now, another thing I didn't point out in the zodiac wheel is the nature of yin and yang of each sign that goes feminine to masculine, feminine to masculine. So, you know, we go through alternating principles on the zodiac wheel of expansion and, let's say, contraction, consolidation, expansion, contraction, consolidation. You see this also in the generations, and the last slide that I'm going to put up, this also shows up in actually the exact populations. They go through those phases. They go through a large large population boom, and then a small, and then a large, and then a small. Pluto Leos is where things start to get yang. I mean, basically that's what Pluto Leo came out of the yin Cancer generation, and things got yang. So what do we say about Pluto Leos? I kind of feel like all I need to say is Woodstock, pretty much. No, actually there's a lot more to say about them. The theme for this generation could roughly be summed up in some of the iconic phrases that this generation coined. If it feels good, do it. Flower power, sexual liberation. I mean, this was a generation that took the changing gender roles from Pluto Cancer and ran with it. So this generation is coming of age in the mid-50s, 60s, and 70s, had been coming of age, and they're coming into power in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, some of them still in those positions of power, and like I said, recent kind of changing of the guards with the Pluto Virgos now starting to come into power, so there's an overlap there. Archetypally, the Leo archetype, as I said before, relates to the solar inner child. So there's a need here, different than the lunar inner child, which are the very sensitive, vulnerable, nurturing needs. The solar inner child you can equate to, let's say, our early grade school years. These are the years where you leave the immediate environment of the home. Mother and father aren't your world anymore. Now you get other children and teachers and other children's parents. They start to come into your world and influence you. And again, ideally, during this time, let's say pre-kindergarten and kindergarten time into first grade, this is where you're encouraged to be creative. You know, this is where you finger paint and you play and you dress up, and everything about your little self is meant to shine. You know, you're meant to make these little finger paintings at school and come home and have somebody put a little gold star on it and enshrine it on the fridge. And that, you know, that era, that time of our life represents what our solar inner child needs are. We need, there's a part of us, in order for us to have a healthy self-esteem, we need to be seen, recognized, we need to be appreciated, our talents need to be cultivated. And in fact, this is a lot where we gain our sense of joy of life through those kinds of experiences. When we don't have that met, and you know, nobody had the perfect childhood, so we all have this in varying degrees. To the Pluto Leos, though, this is very important. When we don't have that met, the sun goes behind the clouds. And then we get issues of personal expression and personal power, which was a term that was bandied around a lot by this generation. Unlike the previous generation, they weren't talking about personal power. That became a big thing for this generation. But one's personal power gets distorted, and then all kinds of jealousies and ego battles. Again, think Pluto Sun. Just think Pluto-Sun contacts in a chart. So you can have power plays and all kinds of manipulative ways to get one's needs met. So just like the lunar inner child can be emotionally manipulative, the solar inner child can be, again, when we're combining Pluto in there, can be manipulative in power games. And so we see this also has affected this generation, or some people of the generation having enacted certain things like that. The polarity point to this sign is Aquarius. And Aquarius, let's say if we have the healthy expression of Leo moving to Aquarius, or Leo integrating the Aquarius polarity, to me the phrase would be, I shine, you shine, we all shine. It's about healthy expression of personal talents that are given over for the good of all of humanity. There's also something in there to me about just creating for the joy of creating. You know, that is when the very healthy Leo archetype is able to de-link itself from the actual the recognition that it needs to get to create, where it just creates for the joy of creating. Okay, major issues that this generation was conditioned by. Some of the early ones were born into World War II, but the majority of them were the result of the boom years after World War II and all the happy sex that happened that then created this generation, which we very commonly know as the baby boomers. They also had because they were born during a boom mentality, there was more economic prosperity. The country was recovering. People were feeling good. They were having babies. There were great prospects for the future. They were encouraged to be expressive. And, you know, an example of that, iconic example, of course, as I said, is Woodstock. And the average age of the person at Woodstock was 22. That's the middle of the Pluto-Leo generation, as Woodstock happened in 1969. So a large majority of them were getting that kind of message, and if they weren't directly at Woodstock, they were influenced by it. And they were influenced by the music of that generation and that festival. So there was an encouragement of kind of, you know, coming out, of being part of the collective, and that you have something to say, that you have something to do. There was, you know, this is part of the gifts of what this generation brought to us. A lot of seed people were in that generation. It was like they were giving us permission to have personal power. Some of this was demonstrated in some of the protests of the time. Of course, the Vietnam War, very big for this generation. And then there was other forms of activism, environmental, social activism. This generation and the next generation, Pluto Virgos, really pushed the agenda of the Green Revolution. So we could say it was kind of born in this generation and became also an issue picked up by future generations, still going on. So the kind of activism that was there. Civil rights, again, was huge for this issue, in this for this generation. In this slide, this is interesting, these top two pictures here, we're all familiar with Norman Rockwell and his idyllic images that he painted back in the 30s, 40s, 50s of America. And, you know, that was where Norman Rockwell was. These two images here are actually Norman Rockwell paintings, and even Norman Rockwell got political in the 60s. I find that interesting. This is about two slain civil rights protesters, and this one was a young girl who was escorted. This is the beginning of desegregation, escorted to school by 4 white marshals. So yes, even Norman Rockwell is getting political then. Okay.
I just have a couple of comments.
Okay.
One is, would it seem that the depth of Pluto Cancer would be affected by the rest of the chart and its inherent strength? So if you could address sort of how it might play out in an individual's chart. Another comment here is Pluto Virgo generation. In a previous radio show you mentioned that the Virgo generation having double digestive issues, and could you speak to that? And another person's just hoping you have time to go through all the different generations.
Yeah, so do I. Which is why the questions probably aren't a good thing. As far as Pluto Cancer in the individual chart, that's another lecture. So I can't address that here. Pluto Virgo I'm getting to. The double digestive I did write about in my book, and I think I'm going to allude to it a little bit when I talk about Pluto Virgo. And yes, let's get to all of the generations. So, is that okay?
Sounds good.
So, also during this generation, interestingly, when I was talking about the kind of do your own thing and go for it, Nixon ended the U.S. being pegged to gold in 1971, and I just found that interesting, that it's like even currency was doing its own thing. It's like currency became free-floating then, but more than free-floating, it became virtual. So this is the beginning of virtuality. Again, an expansion of horizons, an expansion of what's possible to do with one's power. Nixon, of course, was a Pluto and Gemini, interestingly. Tricky Dick, right? You can't make this up. Cult of personality was also big in this generation. This was the era of the rock star. I mean, there was, you know, megalomania, just excess to a certain degree. Politicians gaining in kind of megalomaniac power. CEOs also started to become rock stars in their own right, and they were the ones that went out and built all those McMansions in suburbia. So this generation, as they started to come of age and come into power, you know, that they built their own castles, for God's sakes. Talk about Leo royalty. And they built all these McMansions in their parents' suburbia. I just find that interesting. So some of the gifts of this generation, as I said before, they were seed people. They're seed people for all of the progress that's been made, just like the Pluto Cancers were, in self-development and personal power. They got across a collective message that being creative is okay, and also that social activism is okay. They were one of the first generations, certainly coming off the Pluto Cancer generation, to seek self-fulfillment beyond the workplace. So it wasn't that work wasn't important to their self-esteem as much as they sought other avenues and other venues, and that self-fulfillment wasn't completely wrapped up in your career. They gave us permission to explore ourselves. I mean, part of the natural archetype here is creative self-expression. And this generation is characterized by the demographic studies as optimistic, confident, they're achievers, they're individualists. But another interesting point is they're also considered to be one of the most depressed generations, the most addicted, and the first documented generation of increased suicides. Now, these are some recent studies that in 1999 to 2000, the suicide rate among Americans aged 35 to 64, which includes some Pluto Leos and some Pluto Virgos, it rose by 30%. That was even more than during the Great Depression. And this span was not specifically, the time frame here, 1999 to 2010, was not necessarily just about the economic decline. Well, you know, what is that pointing to? I think, to me, boomers, you know, they had this kind of limitless view of the horizon, right? It's the sun. The sun can always regenerate it. It always shines. And so they have this, they're romanticists. They had idealized views of marriage and romance and social status and everything that they were going to achieve. And then, you know, they hit their 40s and 50s, and maybe it's not all they thought it was going to be. So there's a kind of disappointment that happens here. As we know, they also were one of the first generations to start to experience increased social isolation. Again, think about, they grew up in this flowering, you know, free love and peace and love for everybody, which is a very communal polarity point, Aquarius, communal energy. But then when they get into their 40s and 50s, you know, that's not still happening. So there's also increased social isolation, which continues in future generations. You know, another thing with this generation too is the inevitability of aging and how it's depressing to this generation. Again, think of the sun. You know, it doesn't have an ebb and flow like the moon. Yes, it has a night and a day, but the sun's nature itself is just, you know, eternally kind of youthful in a way. And so they have this kind of intrinsically, archetypally, this desire for youth, and this is where this was really starting to be born into our culture, where we moved to a really youth-driven culture. Interesting point to make here is Freud's nephew, this is Sigmund Freud's nephew, was a Pluto in Gemini. His name is Edward Louis Bernays. He's not known a lot, but he is the actual father of public relations as we know it today. And Bernays took what he learned from Freud about subconscious motives and started linking it in war propaganda in the 20s. That's where he worked. Then when he came out of that, he had to come up with a new name because he knew propaganda wouldn't work, so he came up with public relations. The reason why this is important is because this Pluto Gemini, which then sextiles to Pluto Gemini generation sextiles to Leo, there's a real fruition of this guy's work where he tested out this idea where prior to what he was applying, what he learned from Freud, advertising kind of followed Gemini rules. You give people information, you tell them about a product, they like it, they buy it. It was that simple. He was the one that brought in the idea that there's these subconscious motives, and if we can motivate the subconscious motive, the person will be, compulsively drawn to buy a product. So he tried this out mostly on the Pluto Cancer generation. Think, again, Pluto Moon, a little bit of emotional manipulation. But it became the norm in marketing during the Pluto Leo generation. So products, rather than just having information about them, now products are linked with how you feel about yourself. They supply an emotional need. That was never known in marketing before this guy. So that's an important point to see, because that carries forward. And just look around today. Products no longer are just about, something that assists you, that you get information about. They are intricately intertwined, or they've been marketed that way, and we've been believed that they actually affect our quality of life and our self-esteem and our self-image. Pluto and Leo's sextiles to Libra, so there is a renewed idealism that comes through the Libra generation. There's a simpatico between these two generations. And interestingly enough, the demographers also have noticed this, because they call Gen Y, which is the Pluto Libra generation, the echo boomers. So it's not just in numbers, it's in psychological sympathy. Now let's talk about some of the TV shows of this generation. 1960s, so women are starting to feel liberated, and what's interesting is that things get a little lighthearted. So, Leo also has humor, and the first real women comedians are coming out. Carol Burnett, Phyllis Diller. They also had the birth of, is another way of saying, Lost in Space and Star Trek. I think that points a little bit to the Aquarian polarity. But Star Trek is a really interesting one, because there's a Star Trek for every generation from here on in. And this first generation was the Captain Kirk one, where he's just this machismo kind of, screw anything guy. Free love, even if it's an alien. And that morphs, you'll see, in the next generation, when the next generation, Pluto Virgos, got discerning Renaissance man, Jean-Luc Picard. So it's kind of interesting to see that. There was also, let's see, I Dream of Jeannie. That was a real throwback. A woman calling a man master. There was also some superheroes. I think there was, or people got, like the $6 Million Man and the Bionic Woman. I mean, again, this is, Batman came out then. So that there was something about being superhuman also. There were a lot more women shows, like Laverne and Shirley and Mary Tyler Moore. The Love Boat, it's very Leo. MASH was an interesting show. Alan Alda was one of the first sensitive males portrayed on TV, because prior to that it was actually Barney Miller and MASH were two male role models in this generation in the 70s that also influenced Pluto Virgos. But again, an outgrowth from the Pluto Cancer thing that we see kind of taking hold in the Pluto Leo generation. The black people finally had their own TV show, the Jeffersons. They had a life on TV. Mork and Mindy, so instead of exploring outer space, they're having friendships with aliens. There were some unconventional households like Three's Company, Charlie's Angels, this is when sex is really selling, Partridge Family, Single Mom, etc. So few people from that generation. Like I said, the rock star generation, Leo's associated with fame, right, with global influence. And interestingly enough, this is where the one-name rock star came out, or even the one-name personality. There was a whole slew of them born in this generation. Oprah, Spielberg, Sting, Jagger, Joplin, Springsteen, Cher. Like, that's it. You're so famous, you just need one name. John Lennon, of course, was one. Another born then. Bill Gates, Bill Clinton, George Bush Jr., Some of the seed people, as I mentioned before about the New Age movement, also became very popular from that generation. Deepak Chopra, Caroline Myss, etc. They can be looked at as spreading spiritual ideals or commercializing spirituality, whichever way you want to look at it. Counseling this generation. Generally, we get into issues of personal power. It's like I said before, very important for them about knowing how to bring their gifts out into the world. So there can be two sides to this. One of it is, how do I bring my gifts out? Or I'm so gifted and nobody's noticing. Sorry. The emphasis is specifically on creative self-actualization, which brings out both the insecure and the oversecure sides of people. So you can have ego inflation or you can have deflation. So again, we get back to the solar inner child needs. Certainly nobody's solar inner child needs were completely fulfilled, but in this generation then, they're needing to revisit some of that wounding and to heal some of where those need to shine wasn't satisfied, and that they can find that in themselves so that they can bring themselves out into the world and that they can experience a kind of flowering creative self-actualization. Sometimes they don't feel special enough. Sometimes, like I said, it's deflated. But so part of counseling them and helping them to de-link their self-actualization from self-esteem and acceptance. Like, again, that idea of creating just for the joy of creating, about regaining heart, about play, about getting back in touch and revivifying the solar inner child, is a way to help them get in touch with that vital energy that's very necessary to their well-being. I also find in working with Pluto Leos that they do have concerns about, like previous generations, but they're more concerned with their personal legacy, and that can relate to children in creative works, what their impact on society has been or will be. And issues of longevity relating to these things often come up in counseling. Some of these people karmically have had, relating back to creativity, they've had wounds around their creativity. Like the last time they came out with their power, it wasn't so good. Maybe they had child prodigy lives. So all they were known for was their gifts. They could have fame, maybe they had fame or talents or gifts that weren't able to provide either for themselves or others, what we would call the starving artist mentality. That's also big for this generation. Or they wanted to use their gifts or talents to help somebody and they were unable to help them. So this is all ways that one's personal creativity, specifically around giftedness and talents, can be wounded. So let's get to Pluto Virgo. So Pluto Virgo's coming of age in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and coming into power in the 1990s, 2000s, and 2010. And in fact, kind of happening now, a lot of Pluto, I'm one of them, I'm a Pluto-Uranus conjunction. A lot of them now are experiencing their Pluto trine, which can also be seen as a symbol of coming into power. The theme for this generation is, are you ready? Virgo itself is a preparatory archetype. It's about emergence again. It harkens back to the sextile to Cancer. They share this kind of fear of emergence for different reasons. Virgo, it culminates, if you think of the natural zodiac wheel, Virgo is the sign before it reaches above the horizon in Libra, where socialization is initiated. So this is the kind of culmination of the perfection of the individual self before you meet society at large or start to meet society at large. So it's a preparatory archetype. One of the images for Virgo is the pregnant virgin. She hasn't given birth yet there is something very deep inside her that's forming, but it simply isn't perfected yet. And this relates a lot to the Virgo mentality. Virgo often feels, and in fact all my Pluto Virgo clients walk in my door and say, I don't feel good enough, I never feel good enough, and there's a very deep anxiety about that. Jeff Green, my teacher in evolutionary astrology, founder of evolutionary astrology, called it this Virgo neurosis, the paralysis of analysis, that they get stuck in too much over-preparation. Because there's an intrinsic sense of lack. There's an intrinsic sense of inadequacy. They don't feel good enough. So this is the yin to the yang of Leo. So Leo went all out, yang, and Virgo now turns that energy yin, in an attempt to have some kind of perfection of that. Events they're conditioned by. Remember, about half of this generation is the Pluto-Uranus conjunction, and I didn't get into that with other generations because that also is too much information. But some of the things that condition this generation are quite interesting. So we start to see environmental movements really take hold. You know, the 1970s and the 1980s, water's not safe, the sun's not safe, there's a hole in the ozone over here, sex isn't safe because of AIDS, there's gas leaks everywhere, Mount St. Helens blows up, Chernobyl. I mean, all of this, again, think about this idea of purification. So this is a generation that's come in with this idea of needing to purify, and to their consciousness, this is a pretty toxic place. So this generation is very aware of the toxicities, and in fact, it is this generation that brought us a fruition of the alternative health movement, which is the mind-body connection. So yes, there's a great fear of the toxicity of the environment, but that's an awareness that then brings the ability to change it or to come up with different methods, different ways to perfect our ways of using energy, etc. Rainforest issues were big for this group too. The Iran-Iraqi war, and there were 2 oil crises, so there were a few other, Khomeini, 2 oil crises kind of gave another economic downturn during this time. During this time also was the first test tube baby. I found that interesting, that that's a kind of version, a scientific version of Immaculate Conception. They also were influenced by Vietnam and the Kent State protests. Tiananmen Square, challenges to the communist regimes, which this generation, of course the previous generations too, eventually did see the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War. With social consciousness, it is a very socially conscious generation. Their Woodstock of the era was Band-Aid, and that was these guys, Bob Geldof and Midge Ure. They were both late Pluto Leos, but passing to the current iconic generation, you know, band from that era, Pluto Virgo, Bono and U2, also very active in social movements. So this particular concert that happened was in response to the famine crisis in Ethiopia. Think about it again, food, grain, I mean that's what we were doing. Virgo, we were shipping masses of grain to Ethiopia, and Band-Aid was largely responsible for bringing that globally, that consciousness. For this generation, for the Pluto Virgos, music had to have meaning, it had to have a service, it had a purpose. That there was a lot of politics in music at the time. Like I mentioned before, the harmonic convergence also happened during this time, and again I'm thinking of the Virgo-Pisces polarity point too. You know, spirituality needing to be brought back into society in a different way, in an innovative way. The first PCs came out then. Again, now think planetary. We're talking Pluto and Mercury. So now there's going to be an expansion of information. There's going to be an expansion of technology and the way that we disseminate information. CNN, born in 1980s, the first 24-hour news show. And then Nelson Mandela was freed during this time too. Virgo generation, one thing that's been said about them is that they came in to clean up the excesses of the Pluto-Leo generation. You know, that's flippant, but look at Obama with Bush, right? Obama kind of came in the midst of crisis. Virgo consciousness is a crisis-oriented consciousness. Sometimes it only knows how to, it operates best in crisis. So Obama's, you know, inherited this big mess, although apparently he wanted it. So they do say that this generation demographically is more fiscally frugal, that they want more value for their money, and again, think back to the sextile to Cancer. There's some psychological simpatico there. Generation X in demographic studies, they're kind of described as having a certain degree of psychological dislocation, that they have a disdain for authority. I think some of this is the Pluto-Uranus stuff that they're picking up on when they describe this generation. They're described in the workplace as very self-sufficient. They're adaptable but independent, think mutable. And they also view the workplace very much as a place to learn. And in fact, that was a big thing in this generation coming into the workplace, that they got continuing education about their chosen career through their employers. That was a very important value for them. Generation X also marks when we shifted from a manufacturing economy to a service economy. Think again, Virgo, service. Many of them, many people entered the workplace of this generation in the 80s, and it was a downturn then coming off the oil crisis. So they had to develop a strategy of employment, and in the demographic studies they say that they strove to make themselves useful and indispensable as an employment strategy. I find that funny because I think that's exactly what makes Virgo happy, being useful and indispensable. They do say that their careers are more fluid, so they have immutability about them. Another thing that another demographic study interestingly describes them as practical, skeptical, and cynical. Gee, you don't think Virgo's critical, do you? It's interesting, though, to think of the sextile to Scorpio, because this is true of the Pluto-Scorpio generation. There is a general mistrust within that generation, and this is something that Virgo and Scorpio share as generations. Okay, another subname for Gen X is called the not me generation. They're called the lost generation because prior the baby boomers were known as the me generation, and again they're calling the Pluto Libras. In fact, they call the Pluto Libras the me generation, echoing back to the Pluto Leos. Gen X is called the not me generation, and again this points to the sextile back to the Pluto Cancers that were part of them called the silent generation. I've heard some Pluto Leos say this about Pluto Virgos, like, where are they? You know, why aren't they as known? And, you know, part of it is Virgo's propensity to work behind the scenes. They're simply just doing what they need to be doing and just not making a big fuss about it. During this time, this generation was called the latchkey generation. This is where divorce started to skyrocket, and many of these kids were left alone. So a lot of them, the divorce rate tripled during their time, during their growing up years. And interestingly, in the Virgo archetype, aloneness and loneliness is a core issue. It's a kind of existential aloneness that exists in the core of the soul. Gen X is also often referred to as Gen S for Gen Single. There's more single people, again, think pregnant virgin. There's more single people in this generation than any other age group. They're one of the ones that are trying social online dating more than any other generation. But this also relates to how they feel about themselves, because this is back to that digestion question. Children often blame themselves when a divorce goes wrong, so they intrinsically introject this idea that it must be me, there's something wrong with me. And this psychological principle of introjection is a big part of how Pluto Virgo operates, where it introjects everything from the external environment as if it belongs to itself in an attempt to purify. And they end up taking in a lot of things that don't belong to them. This is where because it rules digestion. So psychologically, that's how it plays out. They're subconsciously taking in everything that's wrong and trying to make it personal, work it out, give it, assimilate it, and then spit it out. The polarity point to Pisces, it's a lot about surrender. It's about allowing things to be imperfect, that it's about the process and not the ultimate result. So i.e. Pluto Virgos, it's not perfect. It's not going to be perfect. It's in the process possibly, and maybe you can help it along, help yourself along in the process of becoming perfect, but it's not perfect. Or the ultimate goal isn't perfection. Everything is evolving. So discernment is also another part of the polarity point of Pisces. Like I was saying about the introjection, taking things in, Virgo needs to discern what belongs to it and what doesn't. That's often a quite an intense psychological process that they need to go through. Let's see, I'll skip over the TV shows for them, but there are some, yeah, I think I already mentioned some of the interesting people from that generation. Obama, Madonna, interesting one. And in fact, I found Madonna's very cusp from Pluto Leo to Pluto Virgo, I believe, is her signature. And I just find it interesting that she came in, one of the songs that put her on a map was Like a Virgin. But she did it in a really Leo way. So yeah, she's 1 degree Virgo. So she's very Leo-like, but masquerading as virgin. Bono, of course, like I said, emphasizing civic duty. Lady Di. Rowling, the Harry Potter author. And here's a couple obvious Pluto, must be Pluto conjunction Uranus. Chris Angel, Marilyn Manson. Simon Cowell, a famous critic. Who'd think he would be a Pluto Virgo? And here's another interesting one, Jon Stewart. Very erudite critical humor. Jon Stewart. And another one, Julian Assange. Again, think of, he's a late Pluto Virgo, but again, think of the combination of Pluto Mercury, right? Getting hidden information out there. Now the other one that is part of the Pluto Libra generation, the following generation is Snowden. And he's a cusp Libra Scorpio, so that's kind of interesting too. This generation, big in this generation, even bigger than in the Pluto-Leo generation, was the self-help movement, which was initiated quite a long time ago in the Pluto-Cancer generation, back in 1935. So the it's sextiles to Virgo. There's a definite simpatico there. But so out of the AA movement came this idea of self-help. And AA itself calls the years of 1955 to 64, which is kind of right in the Pluto-Virgo thing, its own coming of age, and that the following 1965 to 84 was 1 million strong and growing. So this was a period where AA became international as well as grew its numbers. There were a lot of self-help authors, very popularized. Previous generations, sextile, it's a square fruition. It's Dale Carnegie, who was a Pluto Gemini, but again, square to Virgo, Gemini square to Virgo, there's some fruition. He wrote some really, like, wow, totally targeted to the Pluto Virgo people, How to Stop Worrying and Start Living. And of course, one of his earlier books, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Another author, Cassandra Brain Brown, who is a Pluto Virgo herself, born in 1965. Her best-selling books were I Thought It Was Just Me, But It Isn't. And another one is The Gifts of Imperfection. Let go of who you think you're supposed to be and embrace who you are. Well, that's an iconic message for this generation. Counseling this generation, as I think I've covered some of those things already, that self-improvement is a wonderful thing, but not when it's neurotic, and when it comes from that place of a continual place of not feeling good enough. So, they do tend to focus on what's missing, what's wrong with themselves and with others, and so they need to be counseled away from that. Sometimes there is a general kind of social insecurity, and as I said before, emergence is also an issue for them. They never feel good enough, never feel ready enough, and as they're coming into this trine, this is a time, or the ones that are coming into Pluto trine, this is a time for them to be encouraged to just go do it, to unwind this kind of self-created, you know, neurosis and emerge and come out and help them get over some of their self-cancellation. Okay, so Pluto Libra, coming of age in the late 1980s, 90s, and 20s. Again, if you look back at your sheet, this is one of the shorter generations now. So they're classified as a bridge between the Gen X and Gen Y generation. Gen Y continues into the Pluto Scorpio generation. If we think, so the theme for this generation, I would say, is extremity and great expectations. This archetype of Libra is often associated with balance, but when we think about scales, they're not intrinsically balanced. The slightest change can throw off the balance. So the real meaning of the Libra archetype is actually it's about seeking balance, but there's also an attunement to extremity, and I have found this from working with them in individual regressive and counseling work. Many of them are aware of the extremes within their own psyches. This is also, again, think now planetary, think Pluto, Venus. And when somebody has Pluto-Venus in their chart, what are Pluto-Venus contacts? What does that represent? Classically, in evolutionary astrology, we would say that's the classic signature for re-meeting of old lovers from other lifetimes, that there's karmic, romantic partnership relationships that are happening again because there's something that needs to be healed or something that needs to be completed. As a generation, this whole Pluto-Libra generation is coming in with lots of unresolved relationship stuff. Relationship is so key to them, it's so core to their psyche. But they're unwinding, or meant to unwind, the codependencies, the intricacies of all of the issues of relating and all the effects of dysfunctional relating. I mean, think about that. The word codependence wasn't even known to Pluto Cancers. In fact, that came out of the Alcoholics Anonymous movement, and the term was first coined in 1970, just in time for the Pluto Libras. So this is part of the generational task that they have, is to work this out, work out all of these subtle and hidden they've got a lot of karmic baggage around relating. Again, that's individually as well as collectively. Because, you know, Libra is a sign of socialization. It's a sign of the other. And part of what this generation is here to do is to change the way we relate to each other. And they have been doing that. Speaking of the fruition of Cancer to Libra, the gender bending that started in Pluto Cancer is taken as a norm in the Pluto Libra generation. I mean, they have more permutations of and no judgment around, which is wonderful. You know, more permutations of the way people relate to each other. And the Pluto Scorpios that follow them pick that up as well. You know, they're just, I mean, I've seen them, their sexual experimentation and the way that they're just discovering themselves. They're trying to discover themselves in out of the old roles of relating and trying to find new ones. Some of the people in this generation, because archetypally when I was talking about soul groups, Libra relates back to ancient Greece. And the ideals, you know, the ideals of like that democratic society, I think, is like a latent whisper in their psyches of these Pluto Libras. And some of them have that kind of motivation to manifest those kinds of ideals again, the ideals of democracy, of egalitarian, equal society, so on and so forth. And we see this today. We see this in, I just realized I forgot to change my slide. We see this today. The polarity point, one of the difficulties of that, though, is unfortunately humanity doesn't manifest ideals well, and that's where we get into disillusionment and disappointment, and as I mentioned, oops, great expectations. Again, they picked that up from the Pluto Leos. The polarity point is, of course, Aries, and so there is something here for them about going for what they want, about their personal will, about them becoming aware of their personal needs beyond just how they identify themselves. It's a core keyword for this word, how they've identified themselves by relationship or by social group. Because again, that's a karmic thing, the bending to other people's expectations and the changing of oneself just to be socially accepted or to receive love. You know, that's conditional love, or what they feel they need to do to get that. And that's part of what they're meant to heal, and that's what the polarity point to Aries is. It is about stepping into their individuality beyond expectations, their own that they project outward, and expectations projected onto them. Okay, events they're conditioned by. This applies, of course, for many generations, but certainly September 11th was defining for this generation and previous generations. These are they're also known as the WWW generation. They're called the cyber generation. So we'll see that certainly freedom of information started in Pluto Virgo, but now it's really getting out there. All of the social media, that's a phenomenon of this generation, also carries forward into other the future generations. Rodney King riots happened during their time. I think that's interesting because the kind of phrase that came out of that was the, boy, can't we all just get along? And that seems to be the really inherent Libra desire for justice. You know, there's a kind of, can't we all just get along? That idealism. Waco happened, Lady Di's car crash happened, influential to this generation. I mean, no wonder why she was an icon for this era. She's royalty, Leo, of service. She was huge in social service. Pluto Virgos loved that. And she had this lovely Libra grace and Cancerian qualities. So, you know, I could just see that cross-generationally why just archetypally she was such an icon for her era. Mandela became president, and I look at that as that there were issues of justice and social justice coming up a lot in the 80s for this generation, 80s and 90s. Mandela finally becomes president, like justice, finally. Clinton got impeached, but, you know, the question there was that justice or politics? The Columbine shootings. Both shooters were Pluto Libras. Again, just pointing a little bit to the kind of extremity that can be intrinsic within the Libra psyche. The hanging Chads, the 2000 elections, no justice there. And another thing I want to point out that the term ADD was changed to ADHD and largely has been applied to this generation. So yes, we know they're Libran, they're airy, they're connected, they're over-connected in a lot of ways. But that's when this generation is the one that's getting pegged the most with ADD and ADHD. I have the Daily Show on here because, like I said, I know he's a Pluto Virgo, but when this generation, when Pluto Libra was in college, the studies were showing, especially during the elections, they were showing the Gore-Bush stuff, was saying that the majority of college students got their news only from the Daily Show. I thought that was interesting. So he was influential to them. But then, you know, this is also part of that generation. They're a little bit like they want reality but not really. So there's are characteristics of this generation that have to do with denial. And denial has been a karmic pattern sometimes for this generation, where they want the justice so much, or they want the beautiful picture so much, or the ideal love or the ideal relationship, that they will overlook the reality of what's going on, and then denial becomes a defense mechanism. So we can see some of that, little bit of that disconnect sometimes here in this generation. The demographic studies get a little confused with them because as we now start to see Pluto Libra and Pluto Scorpio, you know, 12 years, 11 years, that's covering two generations demographically. So it's really, really interesting. Now, you know, it's hard to tell. Are the demographic studies describing the extremities within the Pluto Libra generation, or are they describing two completely different psychologies? I think it's a little bit of both. But, you know, they say that some studies will say that they're completely team players, and then another study will say they're completely narcissistic. And some people will say that they're completely connected to their family, and then other studies will say that they're completely self-absorbed and a nihilist and that they hate society. So I think that there's a little bit of both. I think there's a little bit of extremity within the generation, but I think more often than not, it's really the Pluto Scorpio, Pluto Libra difference. I mean, they're quite different psychologies. The Libra generation has, again, like I said, echoes back to Pluto Leo. Many of them were raised by Pluto Leos, and they do have a high idealism. Some of their worldview was shaped by their parents' own optimism, and in a similar way, they've been encouraged to do their own thing, so they can have high expectations of themselves and of others. Another thing of this generation, like I said, so the ADD, ADHD thing came out, but this generation is also when indigo children arose. Yeah, airy. I mean, you think again, Venus in an air sign, it's kind of interesting. But with all that airiness comes another thing that's very difficult with this generation, especially for us previous generations. They're so into change for change's sake, like everything just has to be new. And this harkens back to Leo's, you know, view of eternal youth. So the sextile there plays forward in this generation, except the problem is that this generation has the technology to do that. And literally it's like every day they're updating something or changing it, and apps are changing, and my phone changes. I wake up the next morning and I can't find anything on my Droid anymore because they updated it overnight. So it's that kind of mentality, though. I mean, this generation is also the first time in modern industrialized society that those that are shaping the products, and I'm talking specifically technology, Silicon Valley, are younger than those buying them. I mean, think about that. That's really quite interesting. So it's not all, I mean, they're selling to their own generations too, but there's Pluto Virgos and there's Pluto Leos, and some poor little Pluto Cancers that are trying to use the technology that's coming out today. And so this idea of, you know, everything fast and we need it yesterday, and because technology can do that, is problematic for the earlier generations. It may be fine for them, but it is problematic for the earlier generations. I read an article in the New Yorker on Silicon Valley, and this is an interesting thing of where some of this generation is focusing its idealism, because there is a mix of social awareness, just like their Pluto-Leo sextile generation to them, but then there also is there's a disconnect within this generation. Like they're in a bubble. In Silicon Valley, there's no greater bubble than Silicon Valley, because the campuses, the work campuses there are like Norman Rockwell-ish. Again, think back to the other generations. Norman Rockwell-ish kind of existences. Everything is on the Google campus, and the little Google bus picks you up, and you can even live like, most of these people, the suburbs out there to house booming Silicon Valley is spreading into immigrant and migrant worker territory, and little Google buses kind of chug along and pick these people up, and they go to their little idyllic bubble where they just never have to leave. And part of this generation, this is their form of idealism. This article in the New Yorker by George Packer said they actually think that Facebook is going to be the panacea for many of the world's problems. Every global problem is presumed to be redeemable by getting everyone online. He is saying this is a complete fantasy. They have this idea that if teenagers in Yemen had access to the internet, they wouldn't be terrorists. I mean, the interesting thing is they actually, many of them in Silicon Valley, and as from what I understand, it's promoted in Silicon Valley to look at the development of technology as a form of social activism. It's kind of interesting. There's another story of one colleague in Silicon Valley when Barack Obama was visiting there, and the colleague said, "Are you coming to see him?" And the guy said, "No, I'm not going to see him. I'm making more of a difference than anybody in government could possibly make." That's by the development of whatever, apps or whatever they're doing. So, and they believe that's the kind of new ideology. Did you know a slogan on Facebook's wall is called "Move fast and break things"? I mean, that also characterizes this generation. Shake things up, but move fast, do it fast. And don't even, take no prisoners. Again, the generations that are behind this generation that's putting out all the technology we're trying to work with are making our lives very hard. Again, like I said, they're multitaskers, very clear about that. Let me skip some of the TV shows I have for them. They're telling, they're interesting. One person I want to point out that is of that generation, or there's a few of them. Angelina Jolie, she's obviously a very stunning, beautiful woman, but also in human services, she's a Goodwill ambassador. Liv Tyler, another beautiful Goodwill ambassador. Again, think Libra ideals, think Greek beauty. DiCaprio is another one. And then there's a few that represent the kind of extremity, the darker side of that generation, like Joaquin Phoenix, he's a Pluto Libra, Winona Ryder, Drew Barrymore, Alanis Morissette, and the interesting one, Zuckerberg is a 0-degree Scorp retro, so he's literally in between these two generations. And I just find it interesting that, this founder of social media with privacy issues, I mean, that's a very Libra Scorpio thing, always being criticized for privacy issues, or another thing to look at, both of these generations, the Pluto Libras and the Pluto Scorpios, they're the ones that brought us the friends with benefits thing, right? Like they have no problem with that. Oh, she's just a friend with benefits. So another way of looking at it from Zuckerberg, since he sits right in the middle there, is how to make lots of money off your friends and their friends and their friends. So yeah, that's real friends with benefits. So just quickly counseling this generation. Again, they're very enmeshed in the dynamics of relationship, so it's important to help them get to the core lessons of the ways that they're trying to transform and work through those enmeshments. Specifically, codependency is one thing for them to look at, or the dynamics of codependency. They can be very concerned with how they fit into their peer groups. They do compare themselves by societal standards a lot. So this whole comparison contrasting thing is very large in the Pluto Libra archetype. There's a kind of constant monitoring of oneself, and do they fit the standard? And that's something that they need to recognize, that it isn't necessary to do that to oneself. Again, like I said, they're reliving key karmic relationships, so some of them need some help in understanding what are the dynamics that they're bringing in, karmic dynamics that they're bringing in. I find a lot of my Pluto Libras, when I do regression with them, they specifically want to regress around very specific, like, where did I meet this guy and why are we doing this? Very specific relationships. It's an archetype of splitting also. Maybe that's a little too long discussion to have here, but basically hearkening back to Pluto Cancer, where I was talking about that split between the inner world, outer world. The psychological splitting that happens here in Libra is more about when one's own inner world doesn't match the outer world and vice versa, what you get there is that there can be more of an investment in the appearance of the persona rather than the authentic feelings, and that comes because they've suppressed their feelings based on expectations. So a lot of those dynamics need to be uncovered with them. Like I had said, this is a generation, it's an archetype that's aware of extremity because it has within it the whole idea of extremity. And I recently had a Pluto Libra client who said to me that she said, I'm aware of my inner murderer and my pacifist. And that describes this generation, the kind of consciousness that they have. If they're self-aware enough, they can feel that split within themselves. So part of the real work with them is, you know, it's about the inner marriage. It's about being able to marry all of these seeming disparate parts. And so again, in counseling, it's helping them to identify these extreme aspects within themselves and then helping them to find ways to integrate them, to marry them. And as I said before, a little bit about working on issues of denial and how that can become a defense mechanism, and that, yeah, working through that. So, I guess, where are we on time?
We have hit our 2 hours. Well, thank you so much.
Sorry, so sorry. I hope there weren't any. I'm sure there's some Pluto Scorpios out there that now are going to send me pipe bombs because I didn't get to cover their generation.
there was definitely people going, oh, please get to that Pluto Scorpio.
I know. Sorry, guys. We'll have to come back and do it.